by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 1. My name is India Opal Baloney, and last summer my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes, and I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn Dixie grocery store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms around. "Who let a dog in here?" he kept on shouting. "Who let a dirty dog in here?" At first, I didn't see a dog. There were just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers. And there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn Dixie employees running around, waving their arms, just the same way the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly, and he looked like he was having a real good time. His tongue was hanging out and he was wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I had never before in my life seen a dog smile, but that is what he did. He pulled back his lips and showed me all his teeth. Then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked some oranges off a display, and they went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. You could tell that all he wanted to do was get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow he ended up knocking the manager over. And the manager must have been having a bad day, because lying there on the floor, right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him, real concerned, and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn Dixie employees turned around and looked at me, and I knew I had done something big, and maybe stupid too, but I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears up in the air and looked at me, like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again. And then I figured that the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world, that he would want to get called by a name. Only I didn't know what his name was, so I just said the first thing that came into my head. I said, "Here, Winn Dixie." And that dog came trotting over to me, just like he had been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare, like maybe I was making fun of him. "It's his name," I said, "honest." The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into a grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "He got in by mistake. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." "Come on, Winn Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking and he followed along behind me as I went out of the produce department and down the cereal aisle and past all the cashiers and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over, real careful, and he didn't look that good. He was big but skinny. You could see his ribs. And there were bald patches all over him, places where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly, he looked like a big piece of old brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I bet you don't belong to anybody." He smiled at me. He did that thing again, where he pulled back his lips and showed me his teeth. He smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "I know I'm a mess. Isn't it funny?" It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog who has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him. "Let's see what the preacher has to say about you." And the two of us, me and Winn Dixie, started walking home. Because of Winn Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 2. That summer I found Winn Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so, in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that is how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn-Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what, I told Winn-Dixie, you are a suffering dog, so maybe he will take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn-Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs. And I have to admit, he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn-Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet, because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn-Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detweller's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn-Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at the little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he is thinking hard. Daddy? I said. He said back. Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn-Dixie! Winn-Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed. And then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the ground. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn-Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn-Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher, he's a stray if I've ever seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn-Dixie behind the ears. And a less fortunate, too, that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked, real soft, to Winn-Dixie. Winn-Dixie wagged his tail. Well, the preacher said, I guess you found one. Because of Winn Dixie. Because of Winn Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 3. I started in on Winn Dixie right away, trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath. I used the garden hose and some baby shampoo. He stood still for it, but I could tell he didn't like it. He looked insulted, and the whole time he didn't show me his teeth or wag his tail once. After he was all washed and dried, I brushed him good. I used my own hairbrush and worked real hard at all the knots and patches of fur stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed. He wiggled his back like it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him, and he listened. I told him how we were alike. See, I said, you don't have any family, and neither do I. I've got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mama. I mean, I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old. I can't hardly remember her. And I bet you don't remember your mama much either. So we're almost like orphans. Winn Dixie looked straight at me when I said that to him, like he was feeling relieved to finally have somebody understand his situation. I nodded my head at him and went on talking. I don't even have any friends because I had to leave them all behind when we moved here from Whatley. Whatley's up in North Florida. Have you ever been to North Florida? Winn Dixie looked down at the ground like he was trying to remember if he had. You know what? I said. Ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra hard, more than I ever did when I was in Whatley. Winn Dixie twitched his ears and raised his eyebrows. I think the preacher thinks about my mama all the time, too. He's still in love with her. I know that because I heard the ladies at the church in Whatley talking about him. They said he's still hoping she'll come back. But he doesn't tell me that. He won't talk to me about her at all. I want to know more about her, but I'm afraid to ask the preacher. I'm afraid he'll get mad at me. Winn Dixie looked at me hard, like he was trying to say something. What? I said. He stared at me. You think I should make the preacher tell me about her? Winn Dixie looked at me so hard he sneezed. I'll think about it, I said. When I was done working on him, Winn Dixie looked a whole lot better. He still had his bald spots, but the fur that he did have cleaned up nice. It was all shiny and soft. You could still see his ribs, but I intended to feed him good, and that would take care of that. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth because he got into a sneezing fit every time I started brushing them with my toothbrush, and I finally had to give up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better, and so I took him into the trailer and showed him to the preacher. Daddy, I said. He said. He was working on a sermon and kind of muttering to himself. Daddy, I wanted to show you the new Winn Dixie. The preacher put down his pencil and rubbed his nose, and finally he looked up. Well, he said, smiling real big at Winn Dixie. Well now, don't you look handsome? Winn Dixie smiled back at the preacher. He went over and put his head in the preacher's lap. He smells nice too, said the preacher. He rubbed Winn Dixie's head and looked into his eyes. Daddy, I said, real quick before I lost all my nerve. I've been talking to Winn Dixie. Is that right? The preacher said. He scratched Winn Dixie's head. I've been talking to him and he agreed with me that since I'm 10 years old, you should tell me 10 things about my mama. Just 10 things, that's all. The preacher stopped rubbing Winn Dixie's head and held real still. I could see him thinking about pulling his head back into his shell. 1 thing for each year I've been alive, I told him, please. Winn Dixie looked up at the preacher and kind of gave him a nudge with his nose. The preacher sighed. He said to Winn Dixie, I should have guessed you were going to be trouble. Then he looked at me. Come on, Opal, he said, sit down, and I will tell you 10 things about your mama. Because of Winn Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 4. 1, said the preacher. We were sitting on the couch and Winn-Dixie was sitting between us. Winn-Dixie had already decided that he liked the couch a lot. 1, said the preacher again. Winn-Dixie looked at him kind of hard. Your mama was funny. She could make just about anybody laugh. 2, he said. She had red hair and freckles. Just like me, I said. Just like you, the preacher nodded. 3, she liked to plant things. She had a talent for it. She could stick a tire in the ground and grow a car. Winn-Dixie started chewing on his paw, and I tapped him on the head to make him stop. 4, said the preacher. She could run fast. If you were racing her, you couldn't ever let her get a head start because she would beat you for sure. I'm that way too, I said. Back home in Watley, I raced Liam Fullerton and beat him, and he said it wasn't fair because boys and girls shouldn't race each other to begin with. I told him he was just a sore loser. The preacher nodded. He was quiet for a minute. I'm ready for number 5, I told him. 5, he said. She couldn't cook. She burned everything, including water. She had a hard time opening a can of beans. She couldn't make head nor tail of a piece of meat. 6. The preacher rubbed his nose and looked up at the ceiling. Winn-Dixie looked up too. Number 6 is that your mama loved a story. She would sit and listen to stories all day long. She loved to be told a story. She especially liked funny ones, stories that made her laugh. The preacher nodded his head, like he was agreeing with himself. What's number 7, I asked. Let's see, he said. She knew all the constellations, every planet in the nighttime sky, every last one of them. She could name them and point them out, and she never got tired of looking up at them. Number 8, said the preacher with his eyes closed, was that she hated being a preacher's wife. She said she just couldn't stand having the ladies at church judge what she was wearing and what she was cooking and how she was singing. She said it made her feel like a bug under a microscope. Winn-Dixie lay down on the couch. He put his nose in the preacher's lap and his tail in mine. 10, said the preacher. 9, I told him. 9, said the preacher. She drank. She drank beer and whiskey and wine. Sometimes she couldn't stop drinking, and that made me and your mama fight quite a bit. Number 10, he said with a long sigh. Number 10 is that your mama loved you. She loved you very much. But she left me, I told him. She left us, said the preacher softly. I could see him pulling his old turtle head back into his stupid turtle shell. She packed her bags and left us, and she didn't leave one thing behind. Okay, I said. I got up off the couch. Winn-Dixie hopped off too. Thank you for telling me, I said. I went right back to my room and wrote down all 10 things that the preacher had told me. I wrote them down just the way he said them to me so that I wouldn't forget them. And then I read them out loud to Winn-Dixie until I had them memorized. I wanted to know those 10 things inside and out. That way, if my mama ever came back, I could recognize her, and I would be able to grab her and hold on to her tight and not let her get away from me again. Because of Winn-Dixie. Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 5. Winn-Dixie couldn't stand to be left alone. We found that out real quick. If me and the preacher went off and left him by himself in the trailer, he pulled all the cushions off the couch and all the toilet paper off the roll. So we started tying him up outside with a rope when we left. That didn't work either. Winn-Dixie howled until Samuel, Mrs. Detweller's dog, started howling too. It was exactly the kind of noise that people in an all-adult trailer park do not like to hear. He just doesn't want to be left alone, I told the preacher. That's all. Let's take him with us. I could understand the way Winn-Dixie felt. Getting left behind probably made his heart feel empty. After a while, the preacher gave in, and everywhere we went, we took Winn-Dixie, even to church. The Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi isn't a regular-looking church. The building used to be a Pick It Quick store, and when you walk in the front door, the first thing you see is the Pick It Quick motto. It's written on the floor in little tiny red tiles that make great big letters that say, pick, 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 quick, quick, quick. The preacher tried painting over those tiles, but the letters won't stay covered up. So the preacher has just given up and let them be. The other thing about the Open Arms that is different from other churches is there aren't any pews. People bring in their own fold-up chairs and lawn chairs. And so sometimes it looks more like the congregation is watching a parade or sitting at a barbecue instead of being at church. It's kind of a strange church, and I thought Winn-Dixie would fit right in. But the first time we brought Winn-Dixie to the Open Arms, the preacher tied him outside the front door. Why did we bring him all this way, just to tie him up? I asked the preacher. Because dogs don't belong in church, Opal, the preacher said. That's why. He tied Winn-Dixie up to a tree and said how there was lots of shade for him and that it ought to work out real good. Well, it didn't. The service started and there was some singing and some sharing and some praying. And then the preacher started preaching. And he wasn't but 2 or 3 words into his sermon when there was a terrible howl coming from outside. The preacher tried to ignore it. Today, he said. Oh, said Winn-Dixie. Please, said the preacher. Arroo, said Winn-Dixie back. Friends, said the preacher. Arroo, wailed Winn-Dixie. Everyone turned in their lawn chairs and fold-up chairs and looked at one another. Opal, said the preacher. Oh, said Winn-Dixie. Yes, sir, I said. Go get that dog, he yelled. Yes, sir, I yelled back. I went outside and untied Winn-Dixie and brought him inside, and he sat down beside me and smiled up at the preacher. And the preacher couldn't help it. He smiled back. Winn-Dixie had that effect on him. And so the preacher started in preaching again. Winn-Dixie sat there listening to it, wiggling his ears this way and that, trying to catch all the words. And everything would have been all right, except that a mouse ran across the floor. The Open Arms had mice. They were there from when it was a Pick It Quick, and there were lots of good things to eat in the building. And when the Pick It Quick became the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi, the mice stayed around to eat all the leftover crumbs from the potluck suppers. The preacher kept on saying he was going to have to do something about them, but he never did. Because the truth is, he couldn't stand the thought of hurting anything, even a mouse. Well, Winn-Dixie saw that mouse, and he was up and after him. One minute, everything was quiet and serious, and the preacher was going on and on and on. And the next minute, Winn-Dixie looked like a furry bullet shooting across the building, chasing that mouse. He was barking, and his feet were skidding all over the polished Pick It Quick floor, and people were clapping and hollering and pointing. They really went wild when Winn-Dixie actually caught the mouse. I have never in my life seen a dog catch a mouse, said Mrs. Nordley. She was sitting next to me. He's a special dog, I told her. I imagine so, she said back. Winn-Dixie stood up there in front of the whole church, wagging his tail and holding the mouse real careful in his mouth, holding on to him tight but not squishing him. I believe that mutt has got some retriever in him, said somebody behind me. "That's a hunting dog." Winn-Dixie took the mouse over to the preacher and dropped it at his feet. And when the mouse tried to get away, Winn-Dixie put his paw right on the mouse's tail. Then he smiled up at the preacher. He showed him all his teeth. The preacher looked down at the mouse. He looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at me. He rubbed his nose. It got real quiet in the picket quick. "Let us pray," the preacher finally said, "for this mouse." And everybody started laughing and clapping. The preacher picked up the mouse by the tail and walked and threw it out the front door of the picket quick, and everybody applauded again. Then he came back and we all prayed together. I prayed for my mama. I told God how much she would have enjoyed hearing the story of Winn-Dixie catching that mouse. It would have made her laugh. I asked God if maybe I could be the one to tell her that story someday. And then I talked to God about how I was lonely in Naomi because I didn't know that many kids, only the ones from church. And there weren't that many kids at the Open Arms, just Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry, two brothers who weren't twins but looked like they were, and Amanda Wilkinson, whose face was always pinched up like she was smelling something real bad, and Sweetie Pie Thomas, who was only 5 years old and still mostly a baby. And none of them wanted to be my friend anyway, because they probably thought I'd tell on them to the preacher for every little thing they did wrong, and then they would get in trouble with God and their parents. So I told God that I was lonely, even having Winn-Dixie. And finally, I prayed for the mouse, like the preacher suggested. I prayed that he didn't get hurt when he went flying out the door of the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. I prayed that he landed on a nice, soft patch of grass. Because of Winn-Dixie by